The A-10 Thunderbolt II, better known as the Warthog, has been an American air power staple for almost a half century now, and in a real way, so has the effort to retire it. In fact, the first time the Air Force began seriously discussing sending the Warthog out to pasture was all the way back in 1984, the same year A-10 production ended. And while some people will be quick to claim that that's because the Air Force never wanted to fly the close air support mission to begin with, that claim doesn't actually hold up under any real scrutiny. I mean, other Air Force aircraft actually fly more close air support missions than the A-10 does, and they certainly would continue to after its retirement. In reality, all the way back in the 80s, the Air Force already recognized that the A-10 might be tough as nails, but it isn't tough enough to survive in what was becoming an increasingly dangerous sky. But as the years pressed on, America's adversaries changed, and the A-10 found renewed purpose in the asymmetric conflicts of the Middle East, where it was free to prowl the skies at will without any real fear of being shot down. Today, the Air Force, well, still wants to retire its remaining fleet of 160 or so Warthogs so it can use the roughly $1.2 billion a year they cost to maintain to purchase new aircraft. But American lawmakers are not going to let that happen, with an announcement earlier this week that the Warthog will not see its final days in service until 2030 or even later. And while the internet might want to believe that's because the A-10 is the world's only true master of the art that is close air support, that isn't why Uncle Sam wants to keep it around. And while the A-10 may also be pretty well suited for the counter-drone mission, well, that might actually be more like an additional benefit of its service life extension. The real reason the Warthog won't die, it seems to me anyway, really just comes down to numbers. So today we're going to do things a little differently. I'm not just going to walk you through my analysis of historical events and policy documents, contracting forms, and after-action reports. Instead, I'm going to break down just how awesome the A-10 truly is, how it reinvented itself to find a place in America's warfighting strategy, and how now it might have to do that all again. Because the A-10 may deserve to get to fly off into retirement as the close air support king, and to live on forever in our hearts and our memories as that last bulwark between advancing enemy troops and our men and women on the ground. But that isn't what the Air Force needs from it right now, and ultimately, what the Air Force needs to win the next fight is really what matters when it comes to deciding which airframes stay and which ones go. So let's dive into what is sure to be my longest video ever and cover why the A-10 is genuinely one of my favorite jets of all time, why it's also outlived its purpose, and why we still just can't let it go. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is a special edition of Air Power.
What is that? Is that the air raid siren? No, get in the basement.
I'm just kidding with you. It's actually the Sandboxx News app that is totally free and available now on iOS, and I promise it's coming soon for Android too. Now you can find all of our written analysis work from real experts, Navy SEALs, CIA officers, Marines, and much more, not to mention all of our long and short form videos too. Again, this app is totally free and we are really proud of it, so go check it out now. Well, the Warthog has beaten the odds again. The Pentagon has decided to grant the A-10 Thunderbolt II yet another stay of execution, with this legendary close air support jet now expected to remain in service through at least 2030. And while that news is sure to come as a relief to the ground pounders who developed a strong affinity for this warhorse of an aircraft, it does also run directly askew of what the Air Force has been asking to do for decades: retire its oldest Cold War era jets to free up funding to buy new aircraft that, weren't designed in the late 60s. The truth is, it's really almost impossible to talk about the A-10 Warthog online in a realistic and pragmatic way, because the aircraft has become a meme more powerful than even its massive GAU-8 Avenger cannon. Even people who have never worn a uniform are quick to tell you about the A-10's battlefield prowess, the way the burr of its cannon instills fear in America's enemies, and how troops on the ground always knew they were saved when the howl of the A-10's two TF-34 turbofan engines could be heard in the distance. And I'm not here to tell you that all that folklore soaking the breath of aviation subreddits and alpha grunt Facebook bro groups is baseless, because it isn't. The Warthog really is an incredibly tough aircraft that was designed and built to fight what we genuinely believed would be the opening battles of Armageddon, using its 30mm cannon and 11 hardpoints to try to stem the tide of Soviet armor pouring into Europe at the onset of World War III. Not with the goal of beating that advance, mind you, but rather in hopes of slowing it down enough for NATO nations to mass a sufficiently sized counteroffensive. The aircraft is literally built around redundancy, with the understanding that it was going to be fighting for the very survival of the Western world, with the pilot riding in a titanium tub that's designed to withstand even direct impacts from massive 23mm anti-aircraft guns. Calling the A-10 a flying tank, though, seems a bit reductive to me, because as slow and as tough as it might be, the A-10 is also incredibly nimble, with an extremely tight turn radius. Even the placement of its engines, positioned high above the airframe, was dictated by the jet's need to operate from austere environments due to looming fears that nuclear warheads would have already laid waste to all the well-manicured runways in Eastern Europe. In a time when America believed World War III could be right around the corner, the A-10 was a vital piece of what was known as the U.S. Army's air-land battle strategy, engaging multiple waves or echelons of encroaching Soviet armor simultaneously inside natural geographic corridors like the Fulda Gap in Germany, making platforms like the A-10 America's modern equivalent of the 300 Spartans sent to halt the Persian advance at the Battle of Thermopylae. But after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the A-10 had to find a new purpose in the uncontested skies of the global war on terror, where its ability to absorb small arms fire while closing with targets on the ground and engaging them directly from literally just a few thousand feet away gave it a ferocious reputation. In fact, I want to credit a Twitter user named @WillPBach for this insight, because I hadn't thought about it this way before, but I think it's pretty likely that that proximity is part of what's made the A-10 so beloved. That massive 30mm cannon that's become the Warthog's claim to fame has a maximum effective range of only around 4,000 feet, meaning when an A-10 is called in to engage advancing bad guys, the troops on the ground don't just see the result of the airstrike as they would with fighters and bombers dropping munitions from on high. No, they get to see the A-10 come screaming in low and slow before it opens fire. And that has a much bigger emotional impact than a JDAM dropped from 15 miles away at 35,000 feet that you don't even see until it makes impact. But it wasn't just the cannon, or even the A-10's ability to absorb punishment, that made it so useful over Iraq and Afghanistan. It can also loiter for much longer than fighter aircraft like the F-16, allowing the A-10 to hang out over the fight for 2 or even 3 times as long as many other close air support platforms. This stuff is all true, and when you see it recounted over and over again online without any broader context, it is pretty easy to start to think of the venerable Warthog as the only airplane to ever fly the close air support mission well, and that losing it would mean American forces can no longer protect troops on the ground as effectively as they can now. And it's those assumptions, not the Warthog's rightful place in the pantheon of warbirds, that I can sometimes take issue with. Because in reality, the very same things that made the A-10 an online icon also dramatically limit its efficacy and even its value in modern warfare. The A-10's design prioritizes flying low and slow. So slow, in fact, that Warthog pilots often joke about it being the only tactical jet that runs the real risk of bird strikes from behind. But joking aside, the A-10 usually cruises at only around 300 knots, or just about 340 miles per hour, and its maximum speed of around 439 miles per hour is really all but impossible to achieve with a combat load. That means the A-10 would be absolutely trounced in a drag race against America's massive B-52 Stratofortress, a heavy payload bomber capable of delivering upwards of 75,000 pounds of ordnance at a cruising speed of well over 500 miles per hour. In fact, the A-10 would even struggle to beat the prop-driven C-130 Hercules cargo aircraft in that kind of race. That low speed, combined with operating at altitudes so low they often measure in triple digits, makes the A-10 extremely vulnerable to practically every kind of surface-to-air missile threat that exists today, from small shoulder-fired manpads that can't reach higher than 13,000 feet to long-range interceptors launched from modern integrated air defense batteries, and everything in between. Of course, that wasn't much of a concern against terror groups in Iraq and Afghanistan, who had practically no air defense capabilities to speak of, but it becomes a real issue when fighting nation-level threats. Throughout roughly 6 weeks of fighting over Iran during Operation Epic Fury, only 2 crewed aircraft were shot down by Iranian forces, an F-15E Strike Eagle, and then an A-10 that was scrambled to support search and rescue operations. Fortunately, that A-10 made it back to friendly airspace before the pilot had to eject, but if it hadn't, there would have been another American in need of rescue inside Iran. And even in permissive environments that lend themselves well to A-10 operations, its slow speeds and very short combat radius, only about 290 miles with a close air support loadout, both dramatically limit its potential use cases. As one example, A-10s just weren't able to support combat operations against ISIS over Kobani, Syria, specifically due to its range limitations, prompting the US to turn to B-1B Lancer bombers for the job instead, because they can not only carry more ordnance and cover ground literally twice as fast, but they can loiter for longer too. By 2014, Air Force officials hoping to retire their Warthog fleet to reallocate funds toward building new jets tried to dispel some of the Warthog folklore surrounding the close air support mission by releasing hard numbers, showing that roughly 80% of close air support missions in the permissive airspace of Afghanistan were not flown by A-10s at all, but by other fighters and bombers, with F-16s, not Warthogs, accounting for the largest share of CAS sorties, at roughly 33%. Now, it's worth noting, however, that there were certainly critics who challenged the Air Force's claims. Chief among them was probably noted aviation buffoon Pierre Sprey, who I usually try to avoid discussing on this channel because, if you don't have anything nice to say, you shouldn't say anything at all. But because a lot of the criticisms of retiring the A-10 were born out of Spray's own arguments, we're going to have to address them. Now, Sprey, who died in 2021, was always quick to credit himself for designing the A-10 and lots of other successful aircraft, despite not actually having anything to do with the design process at all. Now, you could argue that Sprey had a hand in hashing out some of the early requirements that the Air Force would look to procure, but that's sort of like making suggestions when someone's writing a shopping list and then taking credit for the whole meal after somebody else does the shopping and somebody else does all the cooking. Now, to some extent, you could probably consider Sprey an airpower Luddite, sort of the living embodiment of cultural inertia, who went from campaigning against fighter aircraft even carrying onboard radar, or even using guided missiles in the 1960s, to campaigning against stealth in the 1990s, and then eventually campaigning against the F-35 program in the few places people would still listen, namely on Russian state media. Suffice to say that while I do believe that Spray's old group of buddies, collectively known as the Fighter Mafia, often provided a valuable counterpoint to the prevailing wisdom of their day and prompted useful discourse about what capabilities really did need to be prioritized, their counterpoints were often wrong. And as the years pressed on, Spray would often take credit for programs that found success specifically because they departed from his own design philosophy. Spray's biggest claim to fame, the F-16 Fighting Falcon, found immense success by focusing on exactly the opposite of his advice, incorporating a powerful onboard radar and adding the air-to-ground capabilities that would become a huge part of the Viper's vaunted multi-role pedigree. If Spray and co. had their way, the F-16 would have been little more than a flying 20mm cannon. He was also an outspoken critic of the F-15, saying it was, quote, loaded up with a bunch of junk, electronic stuff that has no relevance to combat, in reference to, and I kid you not, radar. It would, of course, go on to become the most prolific air superiority fighter of the modern era, with a lineage that remains not just in service, but in production to this day. And mind you, he maintained that position for decades into the Eagles' tenure. It's not like the evidence wasn't there to prove him wrong. He also claimed that the 1950s era MiG-21 would, quote, hopelessly whip the F-35 in air combat, and even said that, and I quote, stealth is a scam. It simply doesn't work. And he didn't say that in the 80s or the 90s. He said it in 2014. Okay. I have got to stifle my urge to make this video about how wrong Pierre Spray was about, well, anything with wings. So let's leave him behind by just making it clear that more often than not, the side of the debate that rests on conclusions drawn by Pierre Spray tends to be the losing, or at least incorrect, side. And the A-10 debate is certainly no exception. In fact, I'll quote Lieutenant Colonel Edward Schultes from Air Force Central Command all the way back in 2014, when Spray accused the Air Force of skewing the close air support mission numbers to make the A-10 look bad. Quote, if we were selectively collecting or providing data to make an operational case against the A-10, there's other data, such as response time, loiter time, and total munitions available that could better make that case. Our collection of data on close air support missions flown predates Air Force proposals to divest the A-10 fleet. And just in case that wasn't quite clear, what the Lieutenant Colonel was saying is that there were other, more damning statistics about the A-10's value in the fight than the fact that it flew less than 20% of close air support missions. Its response time, in particular, was also highlighted as an issue the following year by Brigadier General Patrick Malachowski, who was a former A-10 pilot himself. I'll quote him now. For pilots and ground troops, the most important thing is for the warplane to get there and provide support. If time is an issue and you need to get there quickly, then the A-10 is not the preferred platform. Now, again, the internet has a bad habit of turning these discussions into false dichotomies. The A-10 is either good or it's bad, but that isn't how warfare works in real life. The A-10 is incredibly good at flying close air support missions in uncontested airspace against very specific types of unarmored or lightly armored targets at relatively short ranges. But more often than not, close air support aircraft need to cover longer distances than 100 miles or so, and they need to do it quickly enough to get there before the fight is over. That's certainly part of why so many close air support missions in recent decades have been flown by faster aircraft with longer legs. And this is the point in the conversation where a guy in a grunt-style t-shirt usually starts shouting at me about the GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannon and how the Air Force cannot retire the A-10 until the US military has fielded an adequate one-to-one replacement. And as lots of folks have already shouted at me on Twitter this week, that replacement had better not be the F-35, or these guys are gonna be really mad. And before we go any further, I want to say that I agree. The F-35 is not a direct replacement for the A-10, and in the modern era, we wouldn't want it to be. So let's take these points one at a time, starting with the GAU-8, which, as many an internet meme will remind you, is such a massive and powerful weapon that the Warthog was practically designed and built around it. This 7-barrel Gatling gun stretches almost 20 feet long and weighs nearly 620 pounds unloaded. The A-10 can carry a maximum of 1,174 gigantic 30mm rounds, though in practice it's usually limited to 1,150. At a now fixed firing rate of 3,900 rounds per minute, that means this huge weapon can deliver 65 rounds per second, and the aircraft carries just shy of about 20 seconds worth of ammunition in total. With an effective range of about 4,000 feet, A-10 pilots usually fire their GAU-8 in short 1 to 1.5 second bursts, allowing for 8 to maybe even 15 passes with its gun blazing per sortie. Now, this weapon was purpose-built to take on Soviet armor, and as a result, a lot of people still see the mighty GAU-8 as a tank slayer, but the painful truth, and I want to be clear that I don't enjoy telling you this any more than you enjoy hearing it, is that the GAU-8 never was a tank slayer to begin with. In 1978, just 1 year after the A-10 entered service, the Air Force conducted a series of tests, pitting their new attack jet against a half-dozen real Soviet T-62 tanks with different real-world combat loads. Now, the A-10 was loaded with incendiary armor-piercing ammunition and sent in to fly a total of 7 passes against the tanks, firing a total of 957 rounds, with only around 93 rounds actually finding a target and only 17 penetrating the tank's armor. Notably, those penetrations only happened when the A-10 hit the T-62s in the back or in the sides, as none of the rounds that impacted the tank's front armor could penetrate. And that means that of the 957 rounds fired at these tanks from a maximum distance of just 4,400 feet, but most at much closer ranges, less than 10% hit a tank at all, and less than 2% made it through its armor. Of course, the accuracy of the A-10 has improved in the intervening years, but its ability to lay waste to main battle tanks really hasn't. And in its more modern form, the close air support A-10 of recent decades doesn't actually use that cannon nearly as much as you might think. Let's look at the hard numbers we have from the Persian Gulf War, which saw 144 A-10s fly a total of 8,077 combat sorties, where they unleashed a whopping 783,514 armor-piercing rounds, adding up to around 295 tons of depleted uranium. Now, those are very big and very impressive figures, but if you mash them together in a calculator, that actually only shakes out to around 97 rounds fired per sortie. Or if we assume every A-10 that was called on to use its guns flew multiple passes and expended all 1,150 rounds on board, that would mean A-10s burned through all their ammo on only 681 sorties out of more than 8,000. That's about 8% of missions. More often than not, A-10s actually tended to rely on the AGM-65 Maverick air-to-ground missile, which has a maximum range of around 22 miles, or roughly 29 times further than the GAU-8's effective range. A-10s actually launched 90% of the well over 5,000 Mavericks employed throughout Desert Storm. The real way A-10s are most frequently employed in close air support operations is, first, actually delivering no ordnance at all, just flying a show of force that intimidates adversary ground troops, and second, using precision-guided munitions, like that Maverick missile or laser and GPS-guided bombs. This allows A-10s to deliver ordnance with extreme accuracy while taking far less damage, but that runs askew of perceptions of the A-10 as a flying gunslinger, because, well, the gun is what makes the A-10 special, even if it isn't what makes it most effective. And that brings us to the other point that I know is still being typed in the comments below in angry capital letters. that the Air Force can't retire the A-10 until it has a suitable replacement that can't be a fighter, like the F-16, F-15E, or F-35, because none of them can do exactly what the A-10 does. And I would posit to the folks who hold that opinion that America shouldn't field a direct replacement for the A-10 that does all the things that the A-10 does. And that's because the way the A-10 flies the close air support mission is the reason the A-10 is not survivable in a modern fight. Now, we discussed this at greater length maybe a year or two back when rumors were swirling online that a stealth A-10 replacement was in the works, and we broke down why stealth and the A-10 simply do not mix. A radar-wicking design would not protect the A-10 from the short-range infrared-guided missiles that it contends with while flying at low speeds and low altitudes, and slathering the Warthog in expensive radar-absorbent coatings would result in extremely expensive and time-consuming repairs after practically every flight, as that fragile ram took hits from small arms fire during those strafing runs because, well, stealth doesn't work on eyeballs or iron sights either. You just have all the same A-10 problems we've already got, plus the added expense and headaches of low observable maintenance and repair. A stealth A-10 that still uses a big gun to engage troops while flying 200 feet off the ground is just today's A-10, with 3 times the cost and no real appreciable upside. In a high-end fight against a near-peer adversary, the A-10 would not and could not be replaced by any one aircraft, but rather, its very narrow mission set would be distributed among a wide array of aircraft and drone systems that collectively should be able to fly the close air support mission a lot more effectively inside contested airspace. After all, it doesn't matter if the A-10 is the close air support king if surface-to-air missiles leave it smoldering on the ground. Jobs that once went to the A-10 would instead go to any number of assets, ranging from small loitering munitions like the Switchblade 300 up to Group 5 drones like the MQ-9 Reaper, tactical aircraft like the F-15EX, F-16, and yes, even the F-35, and high-end assets like the B-21, as well as just about everything in between. Drones in particular are certain to absorb an increasing portion of the close air support mission, not just from A-10s, but from all aircraft, as troop-portable loitering munitions become even more common. There's no need to wait for an A-10 to arrive when you can launch a half-dozen Switchblade 300s to circle overhead and engage encroaching adversary troops from as far as 6 miles out. All right, I'm going to take a minute because I need to tell you guys how much I hate making this video, because I love the A-10 Thunderbolt II. There's just something so deeply romantic to me about a platform that was designed and built around a single purpose, that was conceived with the express intent of fighting at a disadvantage against a numerically superior adversary in a battle that could decide the very fate of the free world. The A-10 is a shining example of the best combination of American ingenuity and selflessness. A platform designed to send as many Soviet invaders to hell as it could before ultimately taking so much damage that it would meet them there itself, and probably do it all over again. And when that adversary fell, the A-10 found renewed purpose in the global war on terror, striking fear into the hearts of terror groups and insurgents all across the Middle East, and giving American warfighters something to cheer when they saw it broach the horizon. I mean, A-10s have saved my friends' lives. A-10's 8 small arms fire as a matter of course, and regularly made it home after absorbing much more damage than that. They saved lives, they took lives, and they did it all with the heavy-footed panache of a blitzing inside linebacker who doesn't care if you know he's coming, because he's planning to come straight through you. The A-10 is special, not just to the Air Force or to the troops on the ground, but in the grand scheme of air warfare as a whole. It pushed the limits of what attack jets could do, and it reinvented itself to find a place in the fight it was needed in, over and over again. The A-10 isn't junk. It isn't a bad plane, it isn't worthless in the fight, and it isn't too old-fashioned to find any viable use case in the next conflict. But it also isn't nearly as capable as the internet folklore and all those Bert memes would have you believe. And maybe most importantly, it's old. The youngest A-10 airframes in service today are well over 40 years old. In fact, the youngest airframes in service today are older than me. And as you probably know, no piece of equipment lasts forever. Lord knows I would not want to drive a 40-year-old car to work every day. According to the Air Force, each A-10 in service today costs about $8.2 million a year to keep flying. With around 160 Warthogs in all, that means the Air Force will spend about $1.3 billion this year keeping the A-10 fleet alive. Now that is enough money to buy well over 14,000 Switchblade 300 loitering drones, or heck, more than 37,000 much larger Lucas one-way attack drones. If those fleet costs freeze right where they are, and they don't go up due to the A-10 getting older or because of inevitable inflation, just keeping the A-10 fleet alive through 2030 will cost about $5.2 billion. Now that is enough to buy 50 or so extra F-15EXs in 4 years. Or if you'd prefer to stick to drones, it would pay for well over 57,000 Switchblade 300s. Heck, if you want more, we could look to the Army's Purpose-Built Attritable System, or PBAS FPV drone program, which, at around $5,000 a piece, we could buy well over 1 million drones for the price of A-10 upkeep alone. You just can get a lot of capability into the fight for $5 billion. Or we could use it to keep those A-10s in the air for a few more years and then retire them anyway, and have nothing to show for that $5 billion spent. But, and here's the real twist, I don't actually think the A-10's being kept around because it's the only jet that can adequately fly the close air support mission. In fact, I think the real reasons the Pentagon wants to keep the A-10 in service through 2030 have very little to do with the A-10's specific capabilities at all. But, and I'm going to need you to follow me for a minute here, their reasons do actually make some pretty good sense. That is right. After spending all this time telling you all the reasons why the A-10 probably should be retired, I am now going to awkwardly pivot like an Australian breakdancer to tell you why keeping them flying may actually be the right call. We just had to do away with all that Warthog folklore first so that we could get here together. Now, there is a very reasonable argument to be made that the A-10's slow airspeed and long loiter times make it a perfectly suited counter-drone platform for engaging Group 3 drones, like Iran's famed Shahed 136 and Russia's copy, the Garan 2. While using the GAU-8 to shoot these drones down might seem like the best use of the mighty Warthog, that would be a pretty risky approach, as it would often mean flying right through the blast of the drone's 100-plus pound warhead. I mean, that's sort of like flying through the blast of 5 Sidewinders. But A-10's carrying rocket pods packed full of AGR-20 low-cost laser-guided air-to-air missiles would arguably be much better suited for that counter-drone mission in friendly airspace than faster flying fighters like the F-16 and F-15E that have to struggle to fly slow enough to engage these slow-moving drones. And that may well end up being the A-10's tactical role in the next few years, but in a broader strategic sense, keeping A-10s from retirement may be a simple question of numbers. As we've discussed on this channel before, the Air Force is smaller today than at any point in the modern era, with less than half as many operational fighters than Uncle Sam boasted during the Cold War. And despite the high level of capability delivered by these top-tier jets, platforms like the F-22, F-35, or F-15EX, they can still only be in one place at a time, and they can still only carry a limited number of munitions per sortie. Now, according to a 2025 report submitted to Congress, the Air Force needs a minimum of 1,558 combat-coded fighters just to meet the requirements laid out for it in America's National Defense Strategy without significant risk, which, we should note, is already 287 more than the 1,271 that it has in 2026. And those figures are not improving with time, with roughly 3 fighters aging out of service and being retired each year for every new 1 fighter purchased. Without an increase in airframes, and to drill down on that point, without an increase in rails to mount standoff munitions on, the US would have to pulse its air combat operations against a nation like China rather than maintaining continuous pressure. And that is a big problem for a high-end fight. If the US really were to find itself in a conflict with China, there is little chance Uncle Sam would even want to send an invasion force to duke it out on the ground, where A-10s would even be tasked with flying close air support missions. Instead, the much more common tasking A-10s would see in such a fight would be serving as just another airframe with missile rails that can get off the ground, launch some standoff munitions at targets hundreds of miles further away, and then turn around to do it again. It wouldn't be glamorous. It wouldn't be the guns blazing end-of-the-world fight that the A-10 was built for, but it would help American forces maintain a higher sortie rate and a higher operational tempo, helping to keep it raining ordnance on Chinese targets in the limited ways that it can. If such a fight kicked off before 2030, there honestly is a good chance that 160 additional aircraft capable of deploying systems like the ADM-160 Mauled or miniature air-launched decoy could play an important role in saturating and overwhelming enemy air defenses. A-10s could be used to support combat search and rescue operations over islands and even the open ocean, as long as they were relatively close to a friendly airstrip or had sufficient tanker support. And with new low-cost ship-hunting weapons in the works, like Boeing's JDAM-LR Maritime Strike Cruise Missile, they could even become standoff ship hunters in admittedly limited and sort of specific circumstances. To some extent, the A-10 would serve in a similar capacity to some of the legacy RPAs or non-stealth remotely piloted aircraft like the MQ-9 Reaper would, which is currently integrating standoff cruise missiles like the AGM-158 JASSM and the LRASM, or long-range anti-ship missile line, so these notably vulnerable aircraft can be used to increase the mass of munitions flooding into Chinese airspace at long range, and at distances that are great enough to avoid being shot down. These aren't missions that couldn't be flown by any other aircraft. They're missions that could be flown by practically any aircraft. And that is what the A-10 will ultimately become. The old warbird assigned to the handful of roles that it's got left. But while facing a shortage of airframes, those limited roles could certainly matter to the American war effort. So why did the A-10 get yet another stay of execution? Was it its incredible battlefield resilience, or its monster 30mm cannon? No, probably not. It's the 8 hardpoints on its wings and the 3 more on the underside of its body that could potentially be used to launch hardware at targets that it'll never see. And as sad an end as that might be for the infantryman's favorite aircraft, it is still somehow exactly what the A-10 has always done for us. Find a way to fight, in any way that it can. So, while I may have long argued that the Warthog is an incredible jet that has just unfortunately gotten old and outlived its intended use, even I have to acknowledge that this old warhorse might have just enough fight left in it to help the Air Force fill its airframe gap until new platforms are built to step in. So here is to the A-10. It's not just a mean old jet, it is also, one hell of a team player. And with that, ends yet another edition of Air Power from Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure to swing by sandboxnews.com, or better yet, download our all-new Sandboxx News app, which is currently available on iOS, but it's still not quite ready for Android, and I know that's bugging you guys. I promise they are working on it. But for those of you who can, it is a fantastic place to stay on top of all of our written analysis from our team of subject matter experts. I'm talking special operations veterans, intelligence agency veterans, and award-winning journalists, not to mention all of our long and short-form video content. You can find find the app right now entirely for free, and I really recommend you give it a try. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe down below and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.